principles.
Thank you very much. I'd like to put a few other issues to the table here.
I must beg your pardon, I have to go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming. I do appreciate it. An interesting point made by the Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia is that human rights are in fact determined by social and human values. Very often people have recourse to notions of human entitlements, human rights, and this can be the driver for extraordinarily radical social legislation, whether it's considered the right to die, euthanasia, various rights relating to different kinds of sexual unions, and so on and so forth. But he states, and he stated in a judicial and impartial way, that rights in fact are defined by human values, and Professor Rakover also made this point. The question is therefore, how shall we engage in a community-wide discussion of fundamental values when these are in fact being challenged by legislation everywhere? And also in view of the fact that we have people who have been raised in a purely secular tradition, which does not want necessarily to acknowledge something higher than the human being, does not want to refer to God and the religious traditions. The point was made to me actually once by a secular authority that in fact contemporary secular humanism in fact has religious roots. After all, when you look at the traditions of charity, the interest in radical social reform and so on and so forth, these in many cases have religious origins. The notion of very few people are born with a sense of charity. Charity is something which religious tradition was taught. Elsewhere I've seen it written, for example, when one looks at the global makeup of atheism, that it was something which was in fact largely to be found in the Soviet bloc, in areas where communism extirpated, uprooted religious experience. How can we bring humanity, since the Noahide laws necessarily make reference to something which is higher than the human being, how can we bring humanity, including people who are, if you like, the product of more recent secular traditions, into this discourse? Any thoughts in this matter?
Well, I think one place to start is to find the common denominator between different groups of people and different ideologies. For example, both religious thinking and much social thinking recognize that exclusive stress upon rights ultimately is defeating and is harmful to society. Rights have to be bound by a sense of duties and obligations. And while one group of people would think in terms of their duties and obligations to a higher authority, to God, others can find that they adhere and espouse the very same duties and obligations from a more secular approach as part of the social contract, as part of the cost or benefits even, if you wish, of living together in society in which we all benefit from interaction and cooperation. So that if we look for the common denominator, it's not necessarily the source of the duties and obligations, but it's the shared duties and obligations. I recall a passage in Maimonides in which Maimonides distinguishes between adherence and obedience to the Noahide laws because it is God's command, which is to him the ideal, the perfect, the highest form of acceptance of the Noahide laws. On the other hand, he recognizes that some people accept the Noahide laws because they are good social conventions and good social practices. The latter group may not be the ideal holy person, but they are certainly wise people in Maimonides' terminology. So that the possibility that people might have different motivations and different foundations for their adherence to the code of the codes based on the Noahide laws does not prevent our accepting a common code.
Thanks. Thank you for that observation. Would you like to
continue the thoughts of Professor Enker? I will mention that today's trend in the world is to establish conventions not only upon rights but also upon duties. It was after the World War II when René Cassin was he who was on behalf of the committee of drafting the international decision on human rights, and he demanded that it will be accompanied by duties. But it was Mrs. Roosevelt that was opposed. She didn't agree to this because, if you remember, after the World War II, the Germans ignored in all the human rights, and people were afraid not to strengthen today the rights and not to mention the duties. This was 60 years ago. Today, I think, not I think, but the world understands, as I say, in the new conventions, that they base their agreements also upon duties. Because, as another president in America said, don't ask what the state gives me, ask what you are giving to the state or to the society. And this is, I think, today is already, the world is open to such those new ideas. And I think that the Jewish traditions that express the duties of a human being, for example, a very known duty, don't stand idle by the blood of your brother. To be aware of the suffer of others and do your best to help him. It's very, very important value, of course, in the Jewish tradition, but I think that in the world today, people are aware of those ideas and they are open already to listen to such ideas.
There is an interesting point made by a consultant to the Australian government on its value program in schools. The previous Australian government wanted to introduce the teaching of values into schools because it sensed, I suppose, something of a slide in social harmony and cohesion. And it felt that education must include an education in values. Now, the consultant for that program was a person called Professor Brian Hill. And he came up with some very important recognition, not that this was necessarily incorporated into all the government programs. He made the point that values cannot be taught abstractly in school. Honesty, resilience. They will not translate into action in the playground unless there is the factor of belief. A person cannot live an integral ethical existence on the basis of intellect alone. It must be something which actually possesses that person's conscience and belief. And here we come to a notion of a faculty in the human being which is higher than intellect itself. Some call it the soul, some call it conscience, some call it belief.